Helen had always believed in trust. It was the foundation of any strong relationship, the glue that held marriages together. But as she stood in the middle of her living room, staring at Michael's smug expression, she realized just how fragile that foundation could be. She had just stepped through the door after a long trip, expecting a warm welcome, maybe even a kiss on the cheek and a casual, "How was your flight?" Instead, Michael greeted her with a grin that sent a cold chill down her spine. "Helen, you're back," he said, his tone far too casual. "I am," she replied cautiously, setting her suitcase down. She knew him well enough to recognize when something was off. "What's with the smile?" Michael waved his hand dismissively, as though her question wasn't worth answering. But then, with a theatrical flourish, he finally revealed the truth. "Well, I suppose you'll find out eventually. I made a major business move while you were away." Helen's heart skipped a beat. Michael had always been ambitious, sometimes to a fault. But what kind of move was he talking about? She raised an eyebrow. "What kind of move?" His grin widened as he leaned back against the couch. "Your jewelry collection," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I sold it. Every piece." The words didn't register at first. It was as though her brain refused to process them, refused to believe that he could do something so outrageous. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice low, trembling. Michael laughed, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. "Helen, do you have any idea how much those diamonds were worth?" "Enough to jumpstart a venture that's going to put us on the map." "It's brilliant, really. You should be proud." "Proud?" Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms as anger surged through her. He had no right. Those weren't just random pieces of jewelry gathering dust in some forgotten box. They were a part of her history, her family. The sapphire ring her grandmother had given her, the diamond bracelet her mother had worn on her wedding day, even the gold pendant she had bought for herself as a symbol of her independence, they were all gone. "You had no right," she finally said, her voice sharper than she had ever heard it. "Michael, do you even realize what you've done?" He rolled his eyes as though she were being dramatic. "Oh, come on. It's not like you wore half of it. It was just sitting there. This way, it's actually doing something useful." Helen could barely contain the rage boiling beneath her skin. She had spent years curating that collection, selecting each piece carefully, treasuring the stories behind them. And now, in one reckless move, Michael had stripped her of that part of herself without even asking. Her name was Helen Parker, and if there was one thing she had learned in her marriage to Michael, it was that his ambition always came first. When they had first met, she had admired his drive. He had big dreams, and she had believed in them wholeheartedly. She had supported him, stood by him through the failures, the long nights of planning, the endless business meetings. But over the years, she had begun to see the cracks. His charm had a way of masking his true nature, a man who bulldozed through anything and anyone in his way. Still, she had never thought he would stoop this low. But what Michael didn't know, what made his smug grin so infuriating, was that she wasn't as naive as he thought. A few months ago, after hearing about a string of local burglaries, Helen had taken precautions. She had discreetly embedded tracking devices in the clasps of her most valuable pieces. At the time, it had seemed like a small measure, a precaution she had hoped she would never need. But now, as she stood in her home feeling the weight of his betrayal, she realized just how valuable that decision had been. Michael thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted her, made a brilliant financial move at her expense. But he had no idea that the game had only just begun. Helen sat in the dimly lit bedroom, staring at the empty space where her jewelry box used to be. The weight of betrayal pressed heavily on her chest, but underneath the pain, a slow-burning fire of determination took root. Michael thought he had outsmarted her, stripping her of the treasures she had spent years collecting, dismissing them as mere assets to fund his so-called empire. But he didn't know the truth, he had underestimated her. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling not with fear, but with rage. There was one person she could always count on. As soon as Megan answered, Helen could hear the exasperation in her voice. "What now?" Megan sighed, already knowing something was wrong. Helen took a deep breath, steadying herself before recounting everything: Michael's smug confession, the tracking devices she had installed, and most importantly, the proof that her possessions were still out there, scattered across the city. By the time she finished, Megan was fuming. "Helen, you have to go to the police," she said firmly. Helen hesitated. The idea of escalating this, of making it real by filing a report, felt like crossing a threshold she couldn't return from. But then she thought of her grandmother's sapphire ring, her mother's diamond bracelet, the pendant that had symbolized her independence. These weren't just objects, they were pieces of her life. And Michael had taken them as if they meant nothing. "I will," Helen said, a flicker of determination settling in her chest. "First thing tomorrow." That night, sleep was an impossible feat. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thoughts racing through her mind. Would the police take her seriously? Would Michael somehow twist the situation in his favor? She had seen him do it before. His charm was his greatest weapon. But this time, she had something he didn't: evidence. The next morning, she walked into the police station, nerves wound tight. The officer at the front desk greeted her with a polite but neutral expression. "How can we help you today?" Helen steadied her voice. "I need to report a theft." "Was it your property?" "Yes," she replied, exhaling slowly. "My jewelry collection. It was sold without my consent." The officer's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "Let's get some details." Helen was led to a desk where she laid out everything: Michael's actions, the estimated value of the collection, and the tracking devices she had installed. When she pulled up the tracking app and showed the precise locations of her stolen pieces, the officer's neutral expression turned serious. "This is excellent evidence," he said, jotting down notes. "If these tracking devices are active, we may be able to retrieve some of the items." Helen nodded and pulled out a notebook she had prepared overnight, listing each stolen piece along with its approximate value and significance. It felt surreal, seeing them all written out like cold, hard facts, as though they were nothing more than numbers on a page. But they weren't just numbers, they were the last tangible remnants of memories, of moments in her life that Michael had stolen from her. The officer, whose name tag read Detective Carter, looked up from his notes. "We'll start by verifying the locations of the tracking signals. If the items are where you say they are, this could be a straightforward recovery. However, since your husband sold them without your consent, this also constitutes fraud. Are you prepared to pursue charges?" Helen hesitated. The weight of the question pressed down on her. Pressing charges meant there was no going back, it meant making Michael answer for what he had done. For years, she had let him take and take, convincing herself it wasn't worth the fight. But this time was different. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady. "I want him held accountable." Detective Carter nodded, his expression resolute. "Good. Let's get started." As she left the station, a mixture of relief and anxiety churned inside her. Relief that the police were taking her seriously, anxiety over how Michael would react once he realized the police were involved. He had always been good at spinning situations to his advantage, turning himself into the victim no matter how outrageous his actions were. But this time, she had something he couldn't explain away. That evening, Megan came over with a bottle of wine and a determined expression. "Okay," she said, settling onto the couch. "Tell me everything." Helen recounted her meeting with the detective, the evidence they were gathering, and the tracking data that was already leading to potential recoveries. Megan listened intently, her expression shifting between outrage and admiration. "You're handling this better than I would," she admitted when Helen finished. "If it were me, I'd probably be flipping desks at Michael's office right now." Helen laughed despite herself. "Trust me, I've thought about it. But the police have the tracking data, and I think that's my best shot at getting everything back." Megan raised her glass. "To you not letting that smug jerk get away with this." The next day, Helen's phone rang. Detective Carter's voice was calm but firm. "We've verified the locations of the items," he said. "2 are at a consignment store downtown, and another is in a warehouse. We've secured cooperation from the store owners and are moving forward with retrieval. I'll keep you updated as we progress." Relief flooded through Helen. "Thank you," she said, gripping the phone tightly. "Does this mean I'll get them back?" "It's looking good," he confirmed. "But the investigation is still ongoing. We've also flagged your husband's financial activities. I don't want to alarm you, but there may be more going on than just the jewelry sale." Helen's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "There are some unusual transactions linked to his business accounts," the detective explained. "We'll need to look into it further, but this could be bigger than we initially thought." As Helen ended the call, her mind raced. What else had Michael been hiding? Helen sat at her kitchen table, her fingers curled around a steaming cup of coffee, her mind still trying to process Detective Carter's words. There may be more going on than just the jewelry sale. That sentence repeated in her mind like a warning siren. She had walked into the police station expecting to fight for what was rightfully hers, to reclaim her stolen jewelry. But now, it seemed she had uncovered something much bigger, something far beyond sentimental theft. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She pulled up the tracking app on her phone, watching the red dots blink on the map. The locations of her stolen pieces were still there, one in a consignment shop downtown, another in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The police had already started working on retrieving them. But if what Detective Carter suggested was true, Michael's betrayal extended far beyond pawning off her belongings. Her gut twisted as she thought about it. What if he had been lying about more than just the jewelry? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ring of her phone. "Megan." "Hey," Helen answered, her voice strained. "Hey yourself. Any updates?" Megan asked, her voice filled with concern. Helen hesitated for a moment before relaying what Detective Carter had told her, that Michael's financial activities were now under investigation and that his fraudulent behavior might not stop at selling her jewelry. Megan let out a low whistle. "Helen, this is big. I mean, I always knew that man was shady, but I didn't think he was this deep into something." "Neither did I," Helen admitted. "I thought I knew him, Megan. I thought he was just ambitious. But now, I don't even know who I married." There was a long pause before Megan finally said, "You need to be careful. If the police are onto something, Michael might start getting desperate." The thought hadn't occurred to Helen before, but as soon as Megan said it, it made perfect sense. Michael had always prided himself on being in control. If he felt cornered, there was no telling how he would react. "I know," Helen said, exhaling slowly. "But I'm not backing down. He's not getting away with this." The next morning, Helen received a call from Detective Carter. "We verified the locations of the items," he said. "Two of your pieces have already been recovered from a consignment shop." The store owner cooperated fully, provided receipts, and confirmed they were sold under false pretenses. Helen felt a surge of relief. "Does this mean I'll get them back?" "Yes," Carter confirmed. "There's a legal process for returning recovered stolen goods, but given the evidence we have, it should be straightforward. However, there's something else we need to discuss." Helen's fingers tightened around her phone. "What is it?" "We've been analyzing your husband's financial records," Carter explained. "We expected to find a connection between the jewelry sales and his business, but what we found is much bigger. There are suspicious transactions, large sums of money being moved between accounts that don't belong to his company. Some of them are flagged for potential fraud." Helen's stomach dropped. She had spent years trusting this man, building a life with him. And now, she was learning about his crimes through an investigator instead of her own husband. "Are you saying he's been embezzling money?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "That's what we're investigating," Carter said. "But it's looking likely. We're expanding the scope of our case beyond the stolen jewelry. If you have access to any financial records, bank statements, business documents, we may need your cooperation." Helen nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I'll help in any way I can." After hanging up, she sat in stunned silence. How long had this been going on? Had Michael's entire business been built on lies? She thought back to all the times he had dismissed her concerns, telling her to trust him. She had been blind. Determined, she marched upstairs and pulled out a box of old financial documents. Michael had always handled their finances, but she had access to joint account statements, receipts, and tax records. As she flipped through them, patterns began to emerge: withdrawals that didn't make sense, payments to unknown entities. She felt a strange mix of fury and clarity. Michael wasn't just selfish, he was reckless. That evening, as she sat on the couch reviewing the documents, the front door swung open. Michael walked in, tossing his keys onto the counter. "Busy day," he said, running a hand through his hair. "What's for dinner?" Helen didn't answer. Instead, she turned to face him, arms crossed. "We need to talk." Michael's grin faltered, replaced by a wary expression. "What's wrong?" She let out a dry laugh. "What's wrong? You stole my jewelry to fund your so-called empire. And now the police are investigating you." The color drained from his face. But then, as if flipping a switch, he straightened up and smirked. "Investigating me? Helen, be serious. I didn't steal anything. That jewelry was just sitting there collecting dust. I thought you'd be happy it was being put to good use." She shook her head. "Michael, stop lying. They've already recovered some of my pieces. And now they're looking into your business accounts. You're in serious trouble." His smirk disappeared. "You went to the police?" His voice was low, dangerous. "I had to," she said simply. "You left me no choice." Michael's hands clenched into fists. "You've made a huge mistake, Helen. If you think you can tear me down like this, you've got another thing coming." For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She met his glare head on. No, Michael. The only mistake I made was trusting you. But that ends now. Michael stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Helen sat back, her heart still pounding, but her resolve was stronger than ever. This wasn't just about her stolen jewelry anymore. This was about justice. Helen sat on the couch, her hands still trembling from the confrontation with Michael. His threats, his anger, none of it scared her anymore. The weight of his betrayal had transformed into something else entirely: determination. For too long, she had stood in his shadow, letting him dictate the terms of their life together. But this time, she was taking control. The police were closing in on Michael, and with every passing day, more of the truth unraveled. Detective Carter had confirmed that the investigation was expanding beyond just the stolen jewelry. Michael's fraudulent business dealings were under scrutiny, and his empire was beginning to crack. The thought of him finally facing consequences gave her a grim sense of satisfaction. That night, Megan came over again, this time with 2 bottles of wine instead of 1. She plopped down on the couch beside Helen, pouring them both a glass. "All right," Megan said, raising her glass, "tell me everything. How did he take the news?" Helen let out a dry laugh. "As well as you'd expect. He tried to gaslight me, twist it into something I should be grateful for. And when that didn't work, he got angry." Megan rolled her eyes. Classic narcissist behavior. "Did he threaten you?" Helen nodded, swirling the wine in her glass. "In his own way. He said I was making a huge mistake, that I was trying to tear him down. Like I'm the villain in all this." Megan scoffed. "Oh, please. If anyone's been tearing things down, it's him. But you know what? He's scared, Helen. And that means you're winning." Helen exhaled slowly. Winning. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming what was hers, about making sure Michael could never hurt her again. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a call from Detective Carter. "Helen, we've recovered several more pieces from your jewelry collection," he said. "They were traced to a private auction house downtown. The owners have cooperated fully, and we're working through the legal process to return them to you." Relief flooded through her. "That's amazing news," she said, gripping the phone tightly. "There's more," Carter continued, his voice serious. "The financial records tied to your husband's business show evidence of tax evasion and embezzlement. It's a growing case, and the charges against him are stacking up." Helen's breath caught. She had suspected fraud, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach churn. "What does that mean for me?" "For now, you're not implicated," Carter reassured her. "But it's important that you establish clear financial boundaries. If you have any shared accounts, you need to separate your finances immediately. If his business collapses under the weight of these charges, you don't want to be anywhere near the fallout." Helen nodded, determination hardening inside her. "I understand. I'll take care of it." As soon as she ended the call, she dialed her lawyer's number. Within the hour, she was sitting in a sleek office, listening to her attorney review her options. "This is a mess," the lawyer admitted, flipping through the paperwork. "But the good news is, you've already taken the right steps by going to the authorities. Now, we need to move quickly to protect your assets and file for divorce." The word divorce hung in the air, heavier than she expected. She had known this was coming, had wanted this, but hearing it aloud made it real. "What about his business?" Helen asked. "Could this affect me financially?" "Potentially," the lawyer said, tapping her pen against the desk. That's why it's crucial to establish clear boundaries now. If his business is under investigation, we need to ensure your finances remain untouched. Do you have any shared debts? Helen swallowed hard. A few. Some credit cards. The house. Then we start there, the lawyer said. We'll draft a formal separation agreement and begin securing your personal assets. Helen exhaled, nodding. It was time. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork. The legal forms, the financial documents, the divorce filings, it was overwhelming, but it was necessary. She wasn't just leaving Michael, she was cutting him out of her life entirely. When the front door swung open, she didn't flinch. Michael stepped inside, his usual confidence gone, replaced by a mix of frustration and barely contained rage. I know what you've been doing, he said, his voice low and venomous. The police. The bank. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you've caused? Helen set down her pen and met his glare. I didn't cause this, Michael. You did. And now you're finally facing the consequences. He let out a bitter laugh. You think you've won? This isn't over, Helen. She stood, her heart steady. You're right. It's not over. But it's out of your hands now. For the first time, she saw fear flicker in his eyes. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Helen didn't follow. She didn't cry. She simply sat back down, picked up her pen, and kept moving forward. The next day, she received another call from Detective Carter. Helen, the DA is preparing charges against your husband, he informed her. Between the unauthorized sale of your jewelry and the fraud tied to his business accounts, he's facing multiple counts. He's not going to walk away from this. Hearing those words filled her with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Michael's actions had hurt her deeply, but knowing he would be held accountable was a step toward justice. Later that evening, as she reviewed her divorce paperwork, her phone buzzed with a new message. Michael. You really had to drag this out, didn't you? I hope you're happy now. Helen stared at the words for a moment before deleting the message without responding. There was no point. Michael had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. As she sat in her quiet, newly peaceful home, she realized something profound. She wasn't angry anymore. The betrayal, the hurt, it was all still there, but it no longer consumed her. She had done what she needed to do. She had fought back. And now, for the first time in years, her future was truly her own. Helen sat in her lawyer's office, her fingers tracing the edge of the divorce papers. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, anger, determination, but as she stared at the stack of legal documents before her, she felt something new: relief. For years, she had let Michael dictate the terms of their life, always putting his ambitions before her own. But now, that was over. The lawyer cleared her throat, bringing Helen back to the present. You've done the right thing, she said, sliding the papers forward. Filing for divorce now will legally separate you from any financial liabilities tied to Michael's business. Given the charges he's facing, this is the best step you can take to protect yourself. Helen nodded. I know. It just feels surreal. That's normal, the lawyer reassured her. Ending a marriage is never easy, even when you know it's the right choice. Helen took a deep breath, picked up the pen, and signed. The ink barely dried before she felt a weight lift off her chest. This wasn't just a legal document, It was a declaration of independence. Later that evening, she sat at home, sipping tea as she flipped through the financial paperwork Megan had helped her organize. The police had recovered most of her jewelry, and her lawyer had ensured that her personal assets were secure. Michael could no longer touch anything that belonged to her. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. A text from Michael. "You really had to drag this out, didn't you? I hope you're happy now." Helen stared at the message for a long moment. Months ago, this would have hurt. She would have second-guessed herself, wondered if she had been too harsh. But not anymore. She deleted the message without responding. The next morning, Detective Carter called with more updates. "Helen, we've recovered all but one piece of your jewelry. The last item is still being traced, but we should have it soon." Helen smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "That's great news. Thank you for everything, Detective." "We're just doing our job," he said. "But I have to say, not everyone takes the steps you did. You fought back. That takes strength." Helen exhaled. Strength. She hadn't always felt strong. But looking back at everything she had been through, the betrayal, the lies, the fight to reclaim what was hers, she realized she had never been stronger. That evening, Megan invited her out for dinner, a much-needed celebration. Over wine and laughter, Megan raised her glass. "To Helen," she said, grinning. "The woman who didn't just survive, she thrived." Helen clinked her glass against Megan's and laughed. "I don't know if I'd call it thriving just yet, but I'll take it." Megan leaned in, her expression serious. "You took control when it mattered most. Don't forget that." As Helen drove home that night, she thought about Megan's words. For years, she had let Michael's ambition overshadow her own sense of self-worth. But now, the path ahead was clear. No more manipulation. No more deceit. No more living for someone else's dreams. For the first time in a long time, she was free. And as she stepped inside her home, she smiled to herself. This was only the beginning. Helen sat at her kitchen table, staring at the neatly stacked paperwork in front of her. The past few weeks had been the most tumultuous of her life, discovering Michael's betrayal, fighting to reclaim what was hers, and ensuring he faced the consequences of his actions. Now, the final step remained, cutting the last ties that bound her to him. Her lawyer had assured her that once the divorce was finalized, she would be completely separated from Michael's financial mess. His fraudulent business dealings, his reckless decisions, his debts, none of them would touch her. The thought was both liberating and sobering. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was Detective Carter. "Helen, I wanted to update you on Michael's case," he said. "The district attorney has officially filed charges. Between the unauthorized sale of your jewelry and the financial fraud, he's facing multiple counts. He won't be walking away from this easily." Helen let out a slow breath, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "Thank you, Detective. Does this mean I'll be able to recover everything he sold?" "It's looking likely," Carter replied. "We've been working with the involved parties, and most have agreed to return the items to you once the legal process allows it. More importantly, Michael is being held accountable." Helen nodded to herself. That was what mattered most. She had spent so long watching Michael manipulate situations to his advantage, twisting the truth to suit his needs. But now, the truth was catching up to him, and for once, he couldn't talk his way out of it. After the call, she sat in silence for a long time, reflecting on how much had changed. There was a time when she would have done anything to protect Michael, to preserve the illusion of the life they had built together. She had loved him once deeply. But love without respect, without trust, was nothing more than an illusion. And Michael had shattered it long before she ever set foot in that police station. That evening, Megan came over, as she often did lately, bringing with her a sense of normalcy and support. "So," Megan said, pouring them both a glass of wine. "What's next for Helen Parker?" Helen smiled, the question catching her off guard. For so long, her life had revolved around Michael, his dreams, his business, his ambitions. Now, for the first time in years, she had the chance to think about herself. "I don't know," she admitted. "And I think that's the best part." Megan grinned. "Now that's an answer I like." They toasted, clinking glasses, the sound light and full of promise. The next morning, Helen met with her lawyer one last time. "The divorce filings have been processed," the lawyer said, handing her the final paperwork. "As of today, you are legally free of any financial connection to Michael." Helen ran her fingers over the documents, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and finality. "Thank you," she said softly. As she walked out of the office, a sense of peace settled over her. The storm had passed. She had fought back, reclaimed what was hers, and walked away stronger than before. When she returned home, she took one last look around. It wasn't just a house, it was her space now. No lingering shadows of Michael's presence, no reminders of the life she had left behind. For the first time in years, she felt light. Free. Ready. And as she stepped forward, she knew one thing for certain: her future was finally her own to define. Helen had once believed that love and trust were the foundation of a lasting marriage. But after Michael's betrayal, selling her cherished jewelry without consent, manipulating her trust, and hiding his fraudulent activities, she realized that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. What began as a fight for her stolen possessions soon turned into a battle for justice, and more importantly, for herself. For years, she had put Michael's ambitions before her own, allowing his charm and confidence to overshadow her instincts. But when she discovered the depth of his deceit, she refused to be a victim. With unwavering determination, she gathered evidence, worked with the police, and fought to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Through every step, filing a police report, facing Michael's threats, and ultimately divorcing him, Helen grew stronger. She was no longer defined by his actions or controlled by his manipulation. Instead, she reclaimed her independence, proving that she was not just surviving but thriving. As she walked away from the past, she embraced the future with newfound confidence. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was hers to define.